So welcome everybody. It's really nice to see you all, or virtually see you all. And I'd like to say welcome to the first in a series of knowledge diplomacy seminars supported by SOAS and ICR Research. And I'm really delighted to be asked to chair this first of three sessions focused on contemporary global concerns where knowledge diplomacy plays a key role. So my name is Deborah Gill, and I'm Vice Provost Education and Student Experience at University College London. And of course, universities are right at the heart of these conversations about knowledge diplomacy. But I'm particularly interested in the subject today because I'm also a medical academic, so formerly ran a medical school. So like everybody else, the global pandemic and how knowledge diplomacy and international relations might play a part in this is right at the center of my thinking as well. So today we focus on a topic that's certainly at the front and center of everyone's thoughts, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And just really to set the scene a little bit, I think in this series, we think about knowledge diplomacy as referring to the role that the creation and dissemination of knowledge plays in international relationships and international relations, and the role those relationships play in influencing higher education, research bodies, and innovation. And looking at the audience and the speakers today, knowledge diplomacy is clearly highly relevant to both academic and policy circles. It addresses the major issues of our time. It relates to the sharing and openness of knowledge between nations and agencies, and it's both theoretical and practical in nature. And in this series, what we're trying to achieve really is to contribute to the understanding of knowledge diplomacy as a practice and within the international higher education sector as a form of diplomatic practice, and feed that into our policy debates. But it also, we hope it maintains a flow of impactful knowledge through UK universities into societies and into communities. I'll do an introduction to our speakers in a moment, but to tell you a little bit about how our sessions will work. So what we've got is we've got three speakers from diverse backgrounds, and I'll introduce them one at a time as they speak. They're each going to speak for about 10 minutes, and they will have a small number of slides, but the second half of the session will really be given over to some questions and some comments and some challenges perhaps from our audience. And we'd really like you to use the question and answer function for that if you could. So if you post your questions there, myself and my colleagues will have a look at those as the presentations are being delivered and begin to pull out some of the really key questions from there. In the meantime, we'll ask you to keep your cameras and your buttons muted, as is the normal etiquette in these sorts of sessions. I will just point out that our first speaker will be leaving a little early today. So if we change the order of the questions somewhat, that's not because we're trying to modulate what you ask, but because Funmi needs to leave. So I'm going to hand over straight away to our first speaker, who's Funmi Olonisakin. Now, just get my slides up. So Funmi, I'm going to ask you to give us an introduction. Funmi's from a university, talk to us from a university perspective. So Professor Funmi, straight over to you. And of course, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Many apologies. Thank you so much, Deborah. I think it's important to ask several questions as we think about knowledge diplomacy in relation to this present pandemic. I think it certainly has opened up a number of questions about the nature of that knowledge, the nature of that diplomacy, and the impact of it on global relationships. So the very first thing is to try to look at the collaboration in science. What's the nature of university partnerships that we're talking about here? And I think the second thing is to look at the impact of those partnerships, still placing the university at the center, but looking at what it means for how we share knowledge and what it means for how the rest of the world tries to come together around this issue. I know that my other colleagues will be picking up some of those questions about the rest of the world. But just very quickly, the nature of university partnerships, interestingly, notwithstanding the pandemic, we have seen partnerships that tend to mirror the existing alliances, the patterns of alliances that we had before universities, but with a difference. And what do I mean by that? Around the pandemic, as soon as we saw the outbreak of COVID-19, you could see many of the usual suspects, partnering, but in the lockdown moment, when walls were being created, when boundaries were being put up, because we had to be in lockdown, because we had to, as nations retreated within their own boundaries to deal with the pandemic, you actually saw greater university collaboration. And you saw the impact of that in the kinds of papers that emerged towards the end of last year, that we actually saw far more collaboration, cross-border collaboration than one would have imagined, especially under that tight competitive environment. If you think of the environment between US and China, that defines actually what the nature of the politics and geopolitics will be during COVID period. So you saw, for example, how apart from US, China, the real surprise was that US universities and Chinese universities were collaborating in massive numbers, notwithstanding the politics of all of it. But apart from that, you saw the usual suspects. It was Canada, it was UK, Canada, UK, US, you saw Switzerland, the very nature of our university alliances in terms of collaboration on the science of understanding the data and understanding what was going on with COVID at that time. It bred, so you can see, for example, US, China, UK, Italy, Canada, Germany, Spain, Australia, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and France had extremely high levels of collaboration with each other. And you saw the patterns of publications at that point in time. But the other thing to note is the kind of division of labor that emerged even within the UK. More than at any other time, the nature of our partnerships, those who were looking at, if you like, the science, the ways in which the virus itself, the genomics of the virus, those who were examining that were doing that on the one hand, but you saw those who were collaborating in the manufacture of ventilators. You saw those who were looking at the pattern of this in pregnant women. That kind of energy and collaboration was something that stood the UK apart in so many ways under those circumstances. But more importantly, more than at any other time, it was the collaboration between university and industry that stood out. And I think it's important to really reveal the nature of some of that collaboration. What I was just talking about in terms of what we did, or what UK universities did when it came to ventilators, when it came to tracking. At King's, for example, we had the Zoe app, but you saw when it came to testing, that collaboration was hand in glove, and it revealed really the importance of science in an environment where actually the policy environment, the governmental institutions, not just in the UK, in a number of settings, had really been somewhat hostile to universities. So that's something that is worth thinking about when we think about the ways in which university collaboration has evolved during the pandemic. But I want to especially then start talking about the impact of these partnerships. And there are two types of impact. You saw the partnerships that favored North-North, as I would say, with the very exception of US and China, as I said earlier. Then you saw those partnerships evolving between UK and in particular, and I want to cite UK and India, I want to cite UK and South Africa, becoming an exception in a continent that was massively marginalized when it comes to the partnerships to really get things going. And the nature of some of these partnerships would be, if you look at Oxford and Wits, University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, that it was the testing of vaccines. You saw some almost blending towards unpleasantness in the ways in which Africans interpreted the kind of testing that might have gone on between France and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It says something about the inequity that comes, that becomes really emphasized during moments like this. And apart from that, you just had large gaps between university collaboration around the pandemic, around questions, even questions of testing, vaccine development, and so on with poorer countries. Now, if we tie that to the way government, and I want to close the loop with governmental behavior, in this case, when you then begin to think about knowledge diplomacy that turns into vaccine diplomacy, and I would not go too far, but just want to highlight a couple of factors to bear in mind. We begin to see how actually the politics of knowledge diplomacy gets wound up in the profit aspects of what we do with industry, what universities would do with industry, because ultimately the manufacture of vaccines has implication for profit. And therefore, as we live in a time when we're talking about IP being transferred so that as many countries as possible could beat this spread of the virus, of new variants of the virus, it becomes really important to look at how to break some of those divides. A country like Russia stands out because when you think of vaccine diplomacy and how China has behaved in relation to the Western world, and you then look at Russia and its footprint in this area, in a place like Africa at the moment, it's probably the only one that immediately gave up IP for further research and development in Africa without too many complications. And even so, what underlines that is something that we have not really gotten into so far. So in a sense, there's a lot of work to be done. That you look at universities, the patterns of collaboration with each other. You look at the involvement of industry, which is necessary. You look at the implications of that in parts of the world that are not as gifted, at least financially, at least developmentally, when it comes to generating knowledge that helps produce the kind of vaccines that we have seen and the rapidity, but then tie that to the sources of funding. And that's where I want to end, to show the patterns that are emerging. When you look at Oxford AstraZeneca, and you begin to see what the Open Society Foundations have done in Africa now by supporting the African Research Association of Research Intensive Universities in Africa, AROA, with the first grant of $1 million, just $1 million as seed grant to begin to promote some of these collaborations. That has invited the kind of funding that UKRI has given to AROA. And that begins to generate a pattern in terms of how we might begin to break this kind of barrier that creates not just inequity, but it means that this virus will be with us for a long time if we're not able to really break this kind of, if we're not really able to bridge the wide gaps that exist in university collaboration, in governmental behavior during this period of the virus, and in the ways in which industry, the partnership between university and industry can mean that we do not deploy IP to support the least privileged in the world to overcome the pandemic. There's much work to be done, but those patterns tell us a lot about where we're at. Thank you so much.
Funmi, thank you so much for that. And it was really good to have a UK perspective, and particularly that focus on Africa. And I think, and that your key point about the link between universities and industry really standing out. So thank you very much. And we look forward to having you for a little while during the question and answer. Next, I think we go over the pond and we hear from Mark Tykocinski. So Mark is the Provost and Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at Thomas Jefferson University. So Mark, could we hear your perspective?
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts. And I'd like to, structure my comments around a reframing of 5 questions. starting with the question of global vaccine inequity. And I think as on the left is sort of the way most of this is framed these days. It's certainly in the United States. It's how do we increase access of low-income countries to the high, medium-income countries pioneering COVID-19 RNA and DNA adenoviral vaccines. And while that's undoubtedly an incredibly important question, I think there's a more fundamental question that tends to be ignored in this discourse, which is, why is it that we're in this situation? Why weren't more conventional COVID-19 vaccines, and by conventional meaning vaccine platforms that are more affordable, more transportable, more scalable, more efficacious, and safer, that have been around for a long time? And why weren't those fast-tracked from the outset? And by those kind of vaccines, I mean viral vectored vaccines and or peptide vaccine platforms. This is, I guess, a little bit self-serving because at Thomas Jefferson University, we were developing a COVID vaccine based on a rabies virus vector platform, which has been shown to have all those positive properties in over 400 million people around the planet. And I emphasize affordability. So it's not just simply, why aren't we sharing more equitably these pioneering vaccines, but why are we even in the situation where the Warp Speed project at BARDA, et cetera, had not really supported that. And that's true to this day. A few of the sort of lingo lines that we hear is this issue of medical nationalism, vaccine nationalism, and the pre-ordering of billions of doses. But again, much of it in these RNA and DNA-based vaccines. Trying to correct that through the World Health Organization, through COVAX, as part of the ACT Accelerator. People talk about framework of equitable allocation of vaccines, but what I would argue is that we need to ask a more fundamental questions. Which vaccines? Why is it that the more affordable ones, the transportable ones, the more appropriate for low-income countries weren't coming through? And I think this calls for more rational, deliberate, coordinated approaches to vaccine development. A section question, just to provoke, is the question of following the science. What is the science? And for starters, let's understand one thing here. Because we're in this with these pioneering vaccines, many that came through emergency use authorization, we are in the largest clinical experiment in human history. The question that is often asked is, what does science tell us about dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? But we actually have to backtrack. And I think all of the things that have happened in the course of this pandemic start to take us back to more fundamental questions that are centuries old. What actually constitutes science? Where does scientific fact cross into scientific dogma and scientific interpretation? And another related question is, how might we democratize scientific discovery? And here are some of the bywords, if you will. We've had tunneled flows of information, and so what the pandemic has particularly shown us is just how elusive it is to get actual scientific consensus. This will be incredibly important now as we start to look at long COVID, post-viral sequelae. And in my phrase, I call it death by 1,000 anecdotes. We're flooded with these anecdotes. How are we going to cut through all of that? How are we going to unpoliticize science? And getting away from the extremes at both ends, the anti-vaxxers, or at the other end, where some would call it hygiene theater. Where do we come to something that truly ties to as close as we can sort of define scientific fact? And there's incredibly powerful tools out there now. This notion of synthetic clinical data, anonymized clinical data. Why can't we dream? Why can't there be a possibility that we would all have access to millions of anonymized patients' records that were synthetic, and therefore we could ask our own questions, essentially crowdsource discovery, even in things as critical as pandemics. And of course, we've been woefully short on public health competencies. A third question, it tends to be framed as how do we promote global solidarity that bridges high, medium income to the low income countries. We've seen this push, one of the sad side effects has been this push towards deglobalization in parts. But there's another related question. It's not just breaking down the bridging of the high income to low income countries, but it's really how do we promote global solidarity that bridges among the high, medium income countries? How do we increase the cooperation? And certainly, as we just heard, there has been a substantial amount of that, but could there be more? And that starts to beg a number of points. We've got to move away from what some have called the coro-nationalism or COVID nationalism to a more unified global response. And I guess what I'm trying to reframe here is that when we think about that, it should be multidimensional. It's not just high to low, et cetera, but really among all countries in a highly dimensionalized perspective. And really the international rules for that engagement. How do we start to harmonize regulatory standards and the whole question of intellectual property access, which obviously is a hot button and incredibly difficult question. A fourth question that I would put on the table here is reframing sort of the whole notion of pandemic preparedness and perhaps broadening what we mean by the concept of preparedness. The tendency in some circles is to simply ask, what will the next pandemic virus be? We do a little lottery, a little guesswork, and then say, okay, what can we do towards that end? But the way that might be reframed is a much broader question, which is how do we prepare for any and all pandemic viruses? I myself am not a virologist, but I'm told that we probably can make a pretty good guess of the 25 or 30 general categories of viruses that may constitute a pandemic of the future. How do we gear ourselves in thinking of that in a much broader kind of way, and its preparedness? And what does real pandemic preparedness really look like? And that discussion can touch on a whole number of different things. Obviously, this has taught us that early public health responses will be critical, slowing international spread. But I think what one would argue here is that even if you don't know the virus ahead of time, there's a lot you can do to sort of be better prepared than we were as a globe. Application ready, some of it virus agnostic, research reagents and platforms, animal models, monoclonals, assays, high throughput assays, molecular banks of potential antivirals. All of these things can be done without necessarily the specificity towards a specific virus, but certainly positioning ourselves so the sprint, once a viral sequence is available and in terms of where we need to go, becomes much more direct. And then there's no question that one of the things that will come out of this pandemic is a much more robust set of viral testing materials, vaccine platforms, medicines, diagnostic platforms, and therapies. And then the critical issue of production and distribution. We really suffered from the issue of bottlenecks and important how we essentially share knowledge in a knowledge diplomacy way in terms of production, distribution, and the capabilities across the globe. And then the fifth question that I would just sort of ask, and I have no answers, and there are many people undoubtedly on the panel and in the audience that are far better equipped to deal with this, but we tend to often ask, how do we adapt our political systems to face the challenges of the post-pandemic era? But I think we have to think again here in perhaps just a very broader, more challenging type of question. How do we frame a post-political gestalt for a more unifying approach to post-pandemic challenges? We've got political fracture pretty much across the world within so many countries. How do we take the whole question of pandemic and pandemic preparedness and sort of apoliticize it, take it into a post-political realm? And again, I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a question worth challenging ourselves around. We're at this, what some would call critical juncture, and trying to forecast where everything goes from here in a post-pandemic world. And the question many are asking is, will it be a lost decade of economic growth? Will there be psychological scarring, especially for the young, who now perhaps see every other person as a potential threat to their health? Educational gaps, increasing social unrest, and we still really don't know how this is going to play out. Will it be the pessimistic, or will we recover and avoid some of these sequelae? And then, of course, the question of hyper-individualism versus social engineering, the two extremities. And it's always safe to try to argue back to the Aristotelian, mean. So we have a series of questions, ill-defined answers, but certainly a lot of room for discourse. And I'll end it here and turn it back to our moderator.
So thank you so much, Mark, for that. I mean, it was quite sobering, but of course real, about talking about the next pandemic. And it was really interesting to hear about your feelings about the connectedness of the response and the importance of the political dimension. So thank you for that. So over to our final speaker now. This is, our previous two speakers were from the university perspective. Our final speaker, Professor Neil Squires, is the Director of Global Health at Public Health England. And Neil, I'd be really grateful to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. I'm having the same issue with my video should have started now. And let me just share my screen as well.
We can see you.
Yeah. And can you see my screen now as well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, and I'll just push it on the slideshow. That's it. Okay, so I'm going to start by we'll focus on the diplomacy and preparedness side, and then move into knowledge. So I'm the Director of Global Public Health at Public Health England, and as many of you know, Public Health England is the national public health agency for England, and on health security areas works very closely with the other nations of the UK. It's what was one of the early casualties of the UK's COVID response, in that a decision was made to change the public health structure so that we had a much stronger capability around health protection, and some of the health promotion and health improvement functions that we have move into a separate organisation to allow that concentration. But as a public health agency, I mean, we are the bit of government, an executive agency of the Department of Health that looks at the response, engages in the data collection, sort of develops the guidance. And there are similar organisations working to ministries of health across the world. Effectively, there is an existing network of national public health institutions and national governments, which are all there and dedicated to responding to health threats, which include pandemic threats. So for me, the question is, what was done previously to ensure and increase the collaboration between those institutions, so that in the event of a pandemic or other health threats, we had a collective response that all of us could deploy. And that leads me on to the international health regulations, because in order to standardize the approach globally, we need global agreements. And the international health regulations, which were updated in 2005, are the global agreement signed up to by 196 member states of WHO, which define a set of competencies and capabilities that countries need to have in place if they are going to be able to respond to sort of pandemic threats and other health threats. And I keep saying other health threats because all hazards is an important part of the preparation. At the moment, we're very much focused on infectious disease threats, but chemical spills, volcanic eruptions, solar flares with massive disruption. There are many other things that have an important impact on the public's health. And so in responding to this pandemic and preparing for future ones, we need to be developing systems that allow us to respond to all potential hazards to threats to minimize risk. Alongside the international health regulations, there was a process for evaluating country competencies, the joint external evaluation process, which involves a self-assessment of national capabilities, but then an invitation of others in to help in the assessment of country capability. So there's already this acceptance that if we want to improve the strength of our own systems, we need to work with others to help us understand our strengths and our weaknesses. Now, over 100 countries have been through that joint external evaluation process. We were very aware that the world was not prepared for a pandemic. I mean, the joint external evaluations highlighted that a number of countries had a number of weaknesses in their preparedness response. But interestingly, some of the countries that had the strongest capabilities, which include the US and the UK, some would say perhaps didn't respond as well to the COVID pandemic. And this is partly because it may be people were preparing for the wrong pandemic. There was a lot of preparation available for influenza, but COVID is a different infection. And the countries that were better prepared were those that had previously experienced the SARS pandemic in 2013. So the Koreas and Singapores and sort of Taiwans that had that previous experience tended to have closed down borders and mounted a response much more rapidly. And the fact that we all have a different understanding based upon experience, which informs our knowledge, demonstrates the value of having sort of global networks which allow that rapid sharing of information. So in addition to the knowledge that informs practice that comes from academic research, the experiential knowledge that comes from actively responding to health threats is equally important in terms of sharing and strengthening sort of knowledge diplomacy. So two of the things I particularly wanted to focus on was the collaboration that already exists because of the structures that have been created through the international health regulations, but also the professional peer-to-peer linkages that have been established through, for example, the International Association of National Public Health Institutions, which networks over 110 organizations in about 95 different countries, which all have taken an active role throughout the pandemic in sharing experience and expertise, having direct peer-to-peer conversations, and that in itself is valuable. But there has also been a considerable effort by WHO to facilitate the global sharing of both clinical and other data that has allowed countries to inform their national response. And everyone will have heard the importance of being led by the science. The science has been contributed to by the academic communities sort of actively networking, but WHO and other organizations have been playing an important role in synthesizing that evidence and making it available. And yeah, that is again critically important to package knowledge so that it is available to policymakers to inform policy. So in a preparedness sense, what we need to ensure is that we have networked institutions able and ready to share, that there are personal connections between individuals, that we have a common framework of actions that need to be taken to constitute preparedness, and that as information becomes available from the next health threat or from current health threats, information is rapidly shared. But one of the challenges with the international health regulations is that it was originally designed to protect things like travel and trade, recognizing their economic value. And so it could be said that maybe there is a need for a significant review of the international health regulations, since one of the most effective actions to address COVID has been stopping travel and trade, whereas IHR was designed to protect that. And it really does depend on what infection you've got as to what response is needed. We've previously seen in Ethiopia and in other countries in response to Ebola, for example, countries have deliberately not declared an epidemic occurring because they didn't want the trade restrictions and the economic consequences. And that's why the protections for travel and trade are built into the international health regulations. So understanding the diplomacy and the politics behind the structures that have been created are also incredibly important for understanding the apparent reluctance to share information when it's needed. And we need to break that down to recognize collectively what is most important for individual countries' health security and global health security. And this will be incredibly important in developing future pandemic responses. So my final point really is that in preparing for the future, we will need to strengthen these global networks in order to ensure that there is both a rapid exchange of information. And we did see this. I mean, the genetic sequences that were undertaken in Wuhan were rapidly shared with the research community, which allowed the work to begin on the development of vaccines very quickly. And we've now got GISAID, an international database, which uploads a lot of the genetic sequencing information, which again allows that information to be made rapidly available. We need to reinforce mechanisms like that. And we're already beginning to see some of the preparedness for future pandemic responses being developed. So the UK, for example, is developing a new variant assessment platform, which is a scaling up of genetic sequencing capacity, working very much with WHO to ensure that we get rapidly access to sequencing information of both COVID but also other viruses as they emerge. And that's essential in order to inform the development of the response and future vaccines. So the knowledge exchange is critically important. But I would like to highlight a huge amount has been done, and thanks to a colleague, Virginia Murray, who's prepared some slides just, and I share these largely to demonstrate that there is a huge resource out there that has been compiled, which does synthesize a lot of the data and information that's been generated in response to COVID. So there have been tremendous successes as a result of the collaborations and knowledge diplomacy brought about by COVID that we need to build on moving forward. And I'm just showing you a few of them. Hopefully the slides will be made available. You can explore these at your leisure. But the synthesis work that has been done by a number of these supported collaborations really is generating a lot of the information that's informing national responses. And the scale is demonstrated in this last slide with the number of projects which are COVID related, the number of different funding agencies, and the overall total investment demonstrating a very serious commitment to sharing knowledge in order to inform the current response, but also hopefully this is a process which will develop the capability for future pandemic capability and capacity building. So I will stop there if you can stop the screen sharing for me.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you all three speakers for keeping to time. So if I could ask our speakers to put their cameras on, that would be really helpful, and we'll start to take a few questions. We've got start coming in, and Funmi, I'll start with you just because people have been mindful of the fact that you're leaving a little bit early, and the first question is particularly for you, but others may want to comment. So Funmi, the question says that you say that university partnerships began almost immediately once the virus broke out. Were these partnerships based on existing relationships, or were they built on this sudden urgent need for new knowledge to be created to combat the virus? And if so, how were the new partnerships created?
That's interesting. I have to say that, so one argument that I wanted to emphasize when I spoke earlier, and I think I made the statement that the partnerships reflected old trends. And that's because people had to start with existing partnerships. And if you look at research partnerships and the trend of it, world-class universities would partner with each other. As one of my colleagues was saying the other day, Laurie Percy from UNSW was saying, universities want to marry up, and that marrying up therefore creates all the exclusionary tendencies that we see. And it's natural that you will go to the existing partners that you have been researching and publishing with, and sometimes those existing partners then draw in their own partners. And that has actually been some of the trend in collaboration. Otherwise, you see every university moving immediately to research, to undertake COVID research, and they partnered with the existing partners. So it's the only pattern I've seen that is new is other partners bringing their own partners into it. So in a sense, it's still, we still replicated the ways in which we had university partnerships. And that's one thing that stands out there. If you even think of the regions that have more or less been excluded from this, high level of partnership publications, you still find out that it's the highest ranking universities in those regions that UK universities will partner with, or if you like, US universities. And just as in, so the only thing that was exceptional as a result of COVID was that notwithstanding the US-China rivalry, the universities, the researchers continued the partnership. And that's why you saw within 6 months, the highest number of publications at all were between US and China. And the next was between US and Canada. And the third was between UK and the US. That mirrors regular forms of partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Funmi. Mark, was that also your experience?
Well, I think I'd approach the question slightly differently. If you look at the partnering that occurred at ground level in the academy, in the universities, it was really nothing short of remarkable in many respects. I come from the world of diagnostics, laboratory medicine, and pathology and lab medicine. And there was a listserv that essentially becomes almost a historical document of a response to a pandemic in terms of what was being shared at the ground level. I think the challenge, and I guess what I was trying to do in my first question reframing, is the gap happened between the academy and the corporate side, between the companies. And when it came to translating of which vaccines, which therapeutics, I think things became quite opaque. And so discovery at the university level met and still meets considerable barriers. And so you ended up with these very expensive, non-transportable vaccines that are not the solution for the majority of Earth's population. And even at this moment, we don't have the answer to that. And also, we do have to understand that the carrier for the RNA vaccines is highly inflammatory. We don't know how many times that can be re-administered. The adenoviral vectors can't be, a given adenoviral vector can't be re-administered because you develop immunity to the vector. So we're going to need a much broader set of vaccine platforms. And yet, at least speaking for the United States, it's almost a deaf ear right now in trying to get that move forward. So we've had great knowledge transfer and diplomacy among many of the universities, but then that transfer of that knowledge and its translation into sort of national level investments is, I think, where the gap exists.
Thank you for that. And I think there's a real question here, isn't it, about where leadership lies in these very diffuse relationships and partnerships. I'm going to ask the next question to Neil, if I may. So Neil, a question from Asan, which is, what can WHO do to make richer countries who have extra doses enough to vaccinate the population twice or 3 or 4 times to give vaccines to poorer countries to fight the pandemic in a more collective way?
Well, there are a couple of mechanisms that have been developed, and sort of COVAX obviously is the prime example, and investing in COVAX to make vaccines available equitably globally to the countries that sign up to that is, I think, the most important mechanism, because it does allow sort of countries to control their access, their own access to it, and it allows the global mapping to take place. You'll also be aware that at the sort of G7 meeting in the sort of UK in Cornwall a couple of weeks ago, there was a commitment to increase some of the sharing of the excess. So I think the UK made a commitment to 100 million doses and the US to 500 million doses. But that's still just a fraction of the excess that is available globally. But part of the challenge is making the vaccines available. The other major bit of the challenge is distributing those vaccines when they are available. So even with the COVID vaccines that are available through COVAX, not all of those that have been made available to countries have yet been distributed. So it's not just about the number of vaccines, it's also about the support for the logistics and the systems to allow distribution. And there is a knowledge exchange that is necessary in order to support countries rapidly scale up their vaccination capacity and also to look at their policies for equitable access to vaccines within countries to ensure that the most vulnerable people are prioritized first, and there's a clear strategy to ensure that everybody is covered. I mean, I've seen economic arguments which just really say it's a no-brainer that we should be absolutely making spare vaccine capacity available to everybody. It's in everybody's interest that the whole world becomes immunized to avoid the ongoing emergence of variants which potentially threaten vaccine viability. So this will happen. I suppose the pace at which it happens will be determined by the political will. But I think eventually everybody's going to realize that there's absolutely no point in maintaining massive stockpiles if the risk is persisting, largely because we have large parts of the world that remain unvaccinated. So I think there is going to be a solution to this, and hopefully the solution will come sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Neil. The next question I'm going to direct to all three of you, if I may. So I'll start with Funmi because I'm mindful she has to leave. So Simon asks, in your opinion, what are the most important features of diplomatic practice you've seen play out in the pandemic response? Is it negotiation, communication, representation, or something else? Funmi, can I start with you?
Thank you. Absolutely. I think excellent question. And I just want to, I'm sure other colleagues will focus on other places. Let me give you the pattern I've seen when it comes to university to university. Outreach is the first thing, communication. As this was happening in China, we would reach out to our students' countries or partner universities to see how we would help. The same thing was what China did when this started spreading in the UK. But in terms of diplomatic practice, I want to go beyond the university and give an example of what we've seen in that diplomacy. And China has been at the top of this, not least because US was dealing with its own challenges and with its position regarding the World Health Organization. And that's been fascinating because the outreach, communicating in the first instance during the outbreak by offering palliatives, and not just doing it through government, state enterprises, if you like, but also doing it through the private sector. What you'd find Alibaba do in Africa, distributing PPE, all sorts of palliatives. Now with vaccine diplomacy, that kicked into another gear completely. Notwithstanding that China had at least wanted to contribute 10 million of its two vaccines to COVAX. There was a separate commitment of 44 million, and you can actually see a direct relationship between Chinese vaccines and those countries that have not received anything from COVAX. More than 20 African countries at the moment have benefited from more than 20 million doses of the vaccines, of the Chinese vaccine. So there's something to the politicization of this diplomacy. And I think G7 commitment with the US talking about 500 million and so on might begin to change things and bring all countries back to COVAX, because I think that's where the diplomacy is best served if it's going to work for the developing world. I just wanted to leave that on the table.
And it's fine for you to leave now because I know you've got another commitment. So I'll ask the same question of Mark, if I may. So Mark, what have you seen? Which are the most important features you've seen being played out?
Well, I think I think there's been a lot of confusion and false starts in terms of the available vaccines that we've seen. You know, I happen to be calling in right now from Rome, where you know, apparently the decision is that those vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine are now going to be, you know, get their booster dose with a Pfizer or, you know, with one of the RNA vaccines. And I think there's I think what we really can benefit from is if there was a higher level of coordination and sharing of information across the regulatory bodies. You know, I think in moving forward, you know, sort of getting the regulatory agents across the world, maybe not fully in lockstep, but some harmonization, I think is going to be absolutely critical. I know in the case of our particular vaccine, you know, we've licensed it for the developing world to an Indian company, and the regulatory hurdles that we've had to face, you know, as tens of thousands are dying, you know, with what we're confident is going to be an effective vaccine can be very frustrating. So I think there's going to be room for a lot more effective, you know, discussion, sharing of information, and harmonization of approaches on a worldwide basis.
Thank you. And finally, Neil, your reflections and your experience on this point.
Well, there are many different levels of diplomacy, and you have to think about what its purpose is. So, I mean, the diplomacy at a operational level, and in terms of sharing of information, the willingness to participate has been excellent. It's where politics comes into conflict with some of that, and the example of some of the negative press around the AstraZeneca vaccine is a prime example of a failure of diplomacy. I mean, effectively, people's concerns about their own country's supply led to a distorted discussion about whether the vaccine was effective or not, or for which populations it was effective, which has contributed to vaccine hesitancy, which is ultimately incredibly unhelpful. And it certainly delayed the delivery of an effective vaccine to large populations in Africa because of those artificial concerns which have been talked up. So yeah, diplomacy can work both ways. It has had its negative effect because of that distorted political discourse that undermined AZ in particular. But there have been other positive aspects in terms of the establishment of a mechanism like sort of, COVAX, which is committed to more equitable distribution. So communication, absolutely essential. I mean, having prior agreements rather than sort of making up policy on the foot helps. So we do need to learn through the current experience and plan better for next time and have much more coordinated communication around this.
Thanks, Neil. And we've got time for one last question, and I might be cheeky and ask Mark to respond to this one. So it pulls in some notions around the university and some notions around the politicization here. So the question from Mickey is, with US and China collaborating at university level, notwithstanding their relationship in government, does this signify that higher education institutions will lead, or at least emphasize the need for further collaboration and efficient global response to crisis?
Yes. Yeah, I think you know, the academies should be unfettered in their collaboration, and I think you know, what we've been seeing is sort of politics getting in the way of that kind of interaction, and as you change. And we're being whipsawed as you go from administration to administration. And so I think there has to be sort of a depoliticization of it. And I think that's, I'm sure I didn't coin the term, but because there's a post everything these days, but to me, this notion of post-political, it goes beyond apolitical. You know, there's certain realms, and this is one of them, where we should really divorce the politics out of it and unfetter the dynamics among the universities. And the reality is we're seeing it. We see it regardless. It's just there's a way to go. There's certainly a way to go.
That was a very definitive answer. Maybe we could have even just left with the yes, but thank you very much for that. So we're coming to a close of our time today. So it's my job as the chair to sort of round up, and I think I've got a one word roundup, which is wow. It's a bit like Mark's yes, and I think it's my job also to say a thank you to Funmi, to Mark and Neil, because they've been really generous with their time, but I think they've given us some really valuable insights and some real take-home messages and some thoughts to ponder about a really wide range of issues that are impacting a really wide range of organizations and groups of people that are coming together to break down some of those barriers, but also some of the barriers that they still face. So really helpful for us. Of course, this is just the first of a series of 3 of these seminars, and the other 2 deal with issues of our time as well. So the next is on climate change and sustainability. And perhaps the final one, which we'd started to begin to touch on at the end of this seminar, is really the future of universities as sites of knowledge production and knowledge sharing. And so that was a really good response to finish on. So I'd like to thank you, everybody, for participating and attending. Thank you to those who've asked questions. Thank you very much, of course, to our panel members. Thank you to Linda Cooper and team for setting this up, and to SOAS and ICR Research for supporting this session. So thank you all and goodbye. And I look forward to seeing some of you in the next seminar.